It was a calm afternoon in a quiet American neighborhood. The sun was high, and the streets were nearly empty. Birds sat on the wires, and people walked their dogs peacefully. Nothing looked strange until a police siren suddenly screamed. In the air, a black car was driving slowly, obeying every rule. But behind it, red and blue lights flashed fast. A police cruiser followed closely, and its horn blared, "Pull over now." The officer shouted into the speaker. The driver, a woman alone, calmly steered the car to the side of the road. She parked, turned off the engine, and placed both hands on the steering wheel. She didn't panic. She didn't reach for her purse. She just sat still, quiet and calm. Officer Reynolds stepped out of his car. He was known in this area. Tall, rough, always serious. People said he had a look when he didn't like someone, and today, that look was on his face. He walked up to the car with a frown, hand on his gun. "License and registration," he said sharply, tapping the window. The woman inside slowly rolled the glass down. She looked at him with steady eyes. No fear, no confusion, just silence. "Did I do something wrong, officer?" she asked her, voice polite. Officer Reynolds squinted. "Don't get smart with me. I asked for your ID." She didn't argue. She simply handed over her license. He snatched it from her hand, glanced at it, then paused. "Her name?" He read it again. "Kamala Harris." The name felt familiar, but he didn't connect it yet. He looked her up and down. "Nice car, must be borrowed." "No," she said softly. "It's mine." He leaned in. "So where are you going, Miss Harris?" "I'm going to meet a group of students at a local school." He smirked. "Do they teach how to break the law in that school?" She stayed calm. "I wasn't speeding. I used my signal. I stopped at the sign. Can you tell me why I was pulled over?" The officer's face tightened. "You were driving suspiciously slow." "That's not a crime," she said gently. He slammed his hand on the roof of her car. "Don't talk back." Across the street, a young man on a bicycle stopped, then a woman with a stroller, then another man, holding a phone. People were starting to watch. Phones began to rise, record buttons were pressed, and the camera was now watching every move. Kamala noticed the attention but said nothing. Officer Reynolds was breathing harder now. "Get out of the car." "Am I under arrest?" she asked, still calm. "No, but I need to search your vehicle." "Do you have a warrant?" "I don't need one," he barked. "Not when someone looks like you." That sentence hit the air like fire. Even the people across the street heard it. A woman gasped, but one of the phones zoomed in. But Kamala didn't flinch. She unbuckled her seatbelt and slowly stepped out. She stood tall, dressed in a simple black suit, hair tied neatly, her shoes clean, her hands at her sides. She didn't look like a threat. She looked like someone with a story. The officer walked around the car, opening doors roughly, checking the back seat, opening the glove box. He searched and searched but found nothing. Then, he slammed the trunk shut, his face now red. "You think you're something special, huh?" he muttered. "Kamal." I looked at him, and for the first time, there was a small smile on her lips. "I didn't say anything. You did." The officer walked toward her, clearly angry. "You know what? Maybe you do need to be taken in." "On what charge?" she asked. "Obstruction, attitude, suspicious behavior." "And what does suspicious look like to you, Officer Reynolds?" He didn't answer, but the crowd around them did. One voice from behind a tree shouted, "We're recording, man." Another said, "She didn't do anything." A child asked his mom, "Why is the policeman yelling at the lady?" The crowd was growing. And Kamala stood still, quiet, like a statue of calm in a storm. The officer pulled out his handcuffs. "Turn around," but before she could move, a voice rang out. It was sharp, powerful, and came from a man walking fast across the road, waving his hands. "Stop right there," the man said. He wore a suit and had a badge in his hand. He showed it clearly. "I'm with the mayor's office." He walked straight up to the officer. "Do you know who this woman is?" The officer blinked. "Do you have any idea who you're arresting on camera right now?" Officer Reynolds stuttered. "She said her name is Harris. Kamala Harris." The man cut in. "Former senator, former vice president, lawyer, human rights leader, and guest of honor at today's school event." Everything went silent. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. The officer looked at Kamala again, now recognizing the face, the name, the presence. His face turned pale. His hand dropped, and every phone caught the moment. Kamala didn't shout, didn't curse. She simply looked at him and said, "Now you know who I am. But earlier, when you didn't, how did you treat me?" He couldn't answer. The cameras were still rolling. Kamala turned to the crowd. "Thank you for recording, for witnessing, not for me, but for everyone who doesn't have a camera nearby." Then she walked back to her car, started the engine, and drove off. But the story was just beginning, because that video was already online, and by nightfall, the whole country would be watching. By the time Kamala Harris reached the school, her hands were still steady, but her heart was heavy. The children were already waiting. They wore bright smiles and held handmade posters that read, "Welcome, Kamala." Some didn't fully understand who she was, but their teachers had told them, "She is someone who changed the world." Kamala stepped out of the car, adjusted her jacket, and took a deep breath. No one at the school knew what had just happened on the street, not yet inside. The school hall was filled with energy. Teachers, reporters, parents all gathered to hear her speak. She was invited to talk about leadership, justice, and standing up for what's right. But Kamala's mind was still on the officer, on his words, on his tone, on how fast he had moved toward violence because of her skin, her silence, and his own hate. Still, she smiled for the children, because they deserved her full heart. But while she spoke inside, something else was happening online. The video from the street, taken by a teenage girl standing near the tree, had already been uploaded, and in just 1 hour, it exploded 1,000 views, 10,000, 100,000.1 million. In the video, Kamala never raised her voice. She never pushed back, she never threatened. And that's what shocked people the most. Because even without shouting, her calm silence exposed everything. The officer's anger, his prejudice, his fear when he realized who she was. By the time Kamala finished her speech and waved goodbye to the students, her phone was buzzing, non-stop, missed calls, text messages, news, alerts, and then a call from her assistant, Jordan. She stepped aside and answered. Jordan, ma'am, it's everywhere. CNN, BBC, Twitter, TikTok, everyone's talking about the video. They're calling it the calm before the truth. Kamala closed her eyes and breathed out slowly. I was hoping it wouldn't become public. It's too late, and honestly, people are angry. Not just because it happened to you, but because it's been happening to people like you for years without cameras. That night, she sat quietly in her living room, holding a warm cup of tea across from her. Jordan showed her the comments. This is what racism looks like when it doesn't wear a mask. He thought she was just another black woman. Now he's in trouble. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her silence said everything. And then one tweet stood out. You treated Kamala Harris like she was nothing because you couldn't see her power. How many others have you done this to? The story was no longer about just one traffic stop. It had become a mirror, and millions were now looking into it. In another part of the city, Officer Reynolds sat in his kitchen. His hands were shaking. His phone kept ringing, but he didn't answer. His face was everywhere now. News channels played the clip again and again. He was trending for all the wrong reasons. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think. He remembered the moment Kamala said, "Now you know who I am. But earlier, how did you treat me?" And that sentence kept repeating in his head. The next day, Kamala received a request for an interview. It was from a major network. Jordan asked, "Do you want to speak, or stay quiet?" She thought for a long moment, then said softly, "It's not about defending myself. It's about giving voice to the thousands who don't have the title or the badge to protect them." The interview aired that same night. Kamala sat across from the reporter, wearing a simple white blouse. No makeup team, no fancy stage. Just truth. She told the full story without hate, without anger. She talked about the first time she was treated differently at age 10. She talked about law school, where people assumed she didn't belong. And she talked about yesterday, when a cop looked at her car, her skin and decided she must be a problem. The reporter asked, "Why didn't you tell him who you were immediately?" Kamala smiled gently. "Because it shouldn't matter who I am. Every person, famous or not, respect." He didn't see a senator. He didn't see a leader. He saw a threat because of my skin. The room went quiet. About millions watched from their homes. Some cried, some got angry, and some finally understood. That interview changed the direction of the story. It wasn't just about Kamala anymore. It was about all the women and men who never got to say, "Do you know who I am?" It was about the kids who felt small, the workers ignored, the students judged. The next day, protests began. Peaceful, united. People carried signs with her face and the words, "I could be her. Respect has no rank. We are all Kamala." Today, and the man behind the badge, Officer Reynolds, he received a suspension notice from the department. An internal investigation was opened. Old complaints were being reviewed. People he had stopped before were coming forward. The truth had found its light. But Kamala's journey wasn't about revenge. It was about making the system finally see what it had ignored for years. And deep inside her heart, as she stood on the steps of the school that afternoon, she knew the stop didn't end on the street. It had just begun a movement. The internet was on fire. Within 48 hours of the traffic stop, the video of Kamala Harris and Officer Reynolds had reached over 40 million views. Across different platforms. News channels ran the footage on repeat. Talk shows discussed it. Radio hosts debated it, and social media was flooded. Every tweet, every comment, every post had one question. If this can happen to Kamala Harris, what hope do the rest of us have? Kamala didn't ask for this attention. She never wanted to go viral for being disrespected. But the world had seen something too real to ignore. The calm woman in the car, the angry officer, the moment of recognition, and the silence that followed, heavier than any scream, in a small apartment in New York. A teenage boy named Elijah sat on his bed, watching the video again. He had dark skin like Kamala, wore cheap sneakers, and walked to school every day. He'd been stopped twice before, once for looking nervous, and once for walking too fast. When he saw Kamala, silent but brave, his chest tightened. He turned to his mother and whispered, "She didn't fight." And still, he wanted to hurt her. His mother, holding a cup of tea, said, "Now the world sees what we live with." Across the country, similar conversations were happening. In homes, in classrooms, even in police stations. Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds' face was everywhere. The department had released a short statement. "We are aware of the incident involving Officer Reynolds and former Vice President Kamala Harris. An internal review is in progress." But people weren't satisfied. Old videos started to appear. Other traffic stops, other people of color, same officer, same tone, same behavior. The internet became a digital courtroom, and Reynolds was now on trial in the court of public opinion. Back at her office, Kamala sat with her assistant Jordan, scrolling through messages. Some were from strangers. "You showed us strength without shouting. I cried watching that video. I've lived that moment. You were grace under fire." Some were from world leaders, activists, and celebrities. But one message hit her the hardest. It was from a woman named Arya, a retired teacher. "I was your teacher when you were 11. You told me once, one day, I want people to see me, not just my skin. I saw you that day, and I see you now. You haven't changed. You've just become stronger." Kamala sat quietly for a moment. Her eyes glistened, just she whispered, "It's not about me anymore." The movement had begun. People were holding up her picture next to their own to show that racism didn't care about fame. They wrote, "I am not famous, but I matter. Dignity has no title." Marches began in cities across America. People held candles at night. They stood in silence for 8 minutes. The average time of most unlawful stops and searches, but not everyone was supportive. A few voices pushed back online. Some said, she should have told him who she was. Others claimed, maybe he was just doing his job. Kamala didn't respond to them. She didn't argue. She didn't attack. Because she knew, the truth didn't need defense. It just needed light. One evening, Jordan rushed into her office, laptop in hand. "You need to see this," he said. It was a live broadcast from a town hall meeting. A group of mothers had gathered, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, all holding photos of their children who had been mistreated by the police. One mother stood up with tears in her eyes and said, "My son wasn't famous. He didn't have cameras. He just had hope, but they didn't listen to him. Kamala, they listened to you. Now, speak for us." The room clapped. Kamala stared at the screen, speechless. These women weren't looking at her like a leader. They were looking at her like a voice they could trust. That night, she sat alone and began writing, not a speech, not a social media post, but a promise, a plan, to build something real. The next morning, she held a small press conference. No fancy lights, no shouting, just a mic, a podium, and her truth. "I stood silent during that traffic stop, not because I was weak, but because I was tired. Tired of fighting the same battle again and again. But now I speak, not for me. For every mother who's buried a child, for every kid afraid to wear a hoodie, for every father who gets tense when a siren sounds. Today, I launched the Respect First Project, a national program to record, report, and reform how police treat people during stops. Because dignity should never depend on your zip code or your skin." The press clapped. Reporters rushed forward with questions, but Kamala didn't stay long. She stepped off the stage and went straight to a small school where a little girl waited with a handmade sign. "I want to be brave like Kamala." Kamala knelt beside her and whispered, "You already are." And far away, in a quiet house, Officer Reynolds stared at his phone again. But this time, no one was calling, no one was defending him, because in just a few minutes of camera footage, his silence had spoken louder than any badge. 3 days after the traffic stop, the internet was no longer just talking about what happened to Kamala Harris. Now, everyone was digging into the man behind the badge, Officer David Reynolds. At first, only a few people had questions, but soon, journalists, lawyers, and even old neighbors began to speak out. "This isn't the first time." Someone wrote on social media, "He did the same thing to my brother. But no one believed us back then." Stories began to pour in. One man, Jamal, came forward on national television. He wore a simple blue shirt and sat nervously in front of the cameras. "My name is Jamal Carter," he said. "Officer Reynolds stopped me 4 years ago. I was walking home from work." He paused. "I was tired. I had paint on my clothes. He told me I looked like trouble. He pushed me against the wall and searched me." The reporter asked, "Did you file a complaint?" Jamal nodded. "I did, but nothing happened. They said there was not enough evidence." Now, his eyes filled with pain. But what if there had been a camera back then? What if I had been famous? More and more people told their stories. A young woman named Melissa, a taxi driver named Raj, a teacher named Carla. All said the same thing. Officer Reynolds didn't see a person. He saw a color, a threat, an excuse. The police department tried to control the damage. They released a short statement. "We are reviewing past complaints involving Officer Reynolds. All matters will be handled with care." But people were tired of careful words. They wanted action. They wanted change. They wanted the truth. Late one evening, a journalist named Riley uncovered something shocking. She found 10 internal complaints against Reynolds from the last 8 years. 10. But not one had ever been taken seriously. Why? Because there were no cameras, no witnesses, just a badge. and a system that believed it without question. Riley posted the documents online. Names were blurred for safety, but the pattern was clear. Same officer, same behavior, same victims, the public's. Anger grew stronger. Protesters held signs that read, 10 complaints equals 10 warnings ignored. Silence is a luxury. We don't have it. How many didn't survive? Back in her home, Kamala read the headlines. She sat quietly with her hands folded. Jordan. Her assistant said, people are finally listening. Your moment gave them courage. Kamala nodded, but that moment wasn't just mine. It belonged to all of us. She opened her notebook and began to write names. Names of every person she could find who had suffered under Reynolds' watch. I want to meet them, she said, and she did. One by one she visited their homes, sat with their families, listened to their stories. Some cried, some smiled sadly, some just thanked her for finally making the world see what they had lived through, in silence. In one small apartment, she met an old woman named Ruth. Ruth's son had once been arrested by Reynolds for resisting, even though witnesses said he was just trying to get home after school. My son was never the same after that, Ruth whispered. They made him feel small, like his life didn't matter. Kamala held her hand. It does matter, and we're going to prove it. The mayor of the city held a press conference. He announced that Officer Reynolds had been placed on unpaid suspension. An independent review team would reopen all past complaints, and a new rule was passed. Every officer in the city must now wear a body camera. Every stop must be recorded. Every citizen deserves respect, but not everyone was satisfied. Some said it was too late, too little. Some officers stood by Reynolds. They said he was just doing his job. But a younger officer named Miguel spoke up on a live interview. Became a cop to protect people, he said. But when you stay quiet while others abuse power, you become part of the problem. Kamala Harris reminded us what justice should look like. Meanwhile, Kamala's Respect First project was growing fast. Donations poured in. Volunteers signed up. Lawyers offered free help to those whose voices were ignored for years. One billboard stood tall in the city center. If silence is power, use yours to protect. Kamala stood in front of that billboard one morning. Beside her was Jamal, Melissa, Ruth, Carlo, Raj, alt survivors.all, strong.all, ready to speak. She looked at them and said, this isn't about punishing one man. It's about changing a system that lets one man hurt many. This is not the end. This is our beginning. And across the city, behind the closed curtains of his house, Officer Reynolds watched them on TV. His badge was now in a drawer. His name was on every news site. His silence had finally made noise, and the world was listening. The world now saw Kamala Harris as the woman who stayed calm during a racist traffic stop. They admired her courage, her silence, her power. But behind her calm face was a lifetime of pain. Not many people knew what Kamala had gone through as a young girl. They didn't know about the insults, the fear, and the small battles she had to fight every day. Now, as protests grew and headlines spoke her name, Kamala knew it was time to tell her full story. Not the story of the vice president, not the politician, but the little girl who learned to stay strong in a world that saw her as less. Kamala sat on a quiet stage in a small town hall. The room was filled with students, mothers, teachers, and workers. No big cameras, no fancy lights, just real people. Jordan, her assistant, stood at the back, watching. He knew this was not going to be a normal speech. Kamala had written nothing, no notes, no script. She stood up, took a breath, and said, I want to tell you about a day I never forgot. I was 12 years old, and it was the first time I was pulled over, not in a car, but on my bike. The room went still. I had just gotten a new bike. I was proud. I rode it every day. One afternoon I was riding home from the library when a police car drove past. Then it turned around and followed me. The officer stopped me. He asked, where did you get this bike? I said, it's mine. He looked at me, really looked, and said, you sure you didn't take it from someone? Kamala paused. Her voice softened. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just stood there, holding my bike, feeling small. A tear fell from someone in the front row. That day, I learned something. You can follow the rules. You can speak kindly. But some people won't see your smile. They'll only see your skin, she continued. As I grew older, I was stopped many times. At the airport, on the street, even at events, until they saw my name on the guest list. They smiled once they knew who I was. But what about all the people who don't have a title, who don't have a microphone, who don't have proof? The room was silent. Every eye was on her. Every heart was feeling her words. She looked around and said, that's why I stayed silent during the traffic stop. Not because I was scared, but because I remembered all those who didn't get to speak at all. A young girl stood up. She looked nervous, but Kamala smiled at her gently. The girl said, how do you stay strong when people hate you for no reason? Kamala walked over and sat beside her. She took the girl's hand and said, I remember who I am. I remember that their hate doesn't shape my worth. And I speak even when it's hard because silence can also be a shield for others. The girl nodded. The room clapped softly, but something deeper had changed. People now saw Kamala not just as the woman in the video, but as a survivor, a fighter, a mirror of their own stories. That same night, Kamala was invited to a major talk show. The host asked her, Why share something so painful now? Kamala looked into the camera, because pain can either break us or build us. And I want to use mine to build something better for the next generation. The next morning, a little boy named Malik walked to school holding his mother's hand. He had dark skin, curly hair, and a shy smile. He looked up and said, "Mom, Kamala's like me." His mother squeezed his hand. "Yes, baby. And one day, you'll be like her." Kamala's story spread again, but this time, not as a headline, as a lesson. In classrooms, in churches, in kitchens, on streets. People said, she didn't just survive racism, she turned it into power. And in her heart, Kamala made a quiet promise. As long as I have a voice, I'll speak for those who are still learning how to use theirs. It was a cool Sunday morning. The streets were quiet, but hearts were not. Across the country, people were gathering in public parks, school grounds, city halls, all for the same reason: justice. What started as a single video of a traffic stop had become something bigger, something stronger, a movement. People of all colors, all ages, all beliefs now stood together, holding signs that read, "Silence isn't peace. We are more than skin." I could be her. Some carried pictures of Kamala Harris. Others held photos of loved ones who had been treated unfairly by police. Their voices were soft, but their message was loud. In Washington, D.C., Kamala stood by a window inside a quiet office. Her face was calm, but her heart was heavy. Jordan, her assistant, stood beside her, holding a file. The Respect First program is now active in 12 cities. Volunteers are everywhere. Kamala nodded. "That's good, but I don't want just programs. I want change, real change." He placed the file on her desk. "Then you might want to see this." The file contained letters, hundreds of them, handwritten, typed, some just a few lines, some several pages long, were from people who had never spoken before. A father who was wrongly arrested in front of his kids. A college student who was stopped and searched on her way to class. A mother who lost her son to a police mistake. Each letter was painful. Each one ended the same way. "Thank you for showing the world what we couldn't." Kamala closed the file and wiped a tear from her eye. "This is the reason," she whispered. "This is the turning point." Later that day, she went to a rally in Atlanta. She didn't walk to the front. She didn't take the microphone. She stood quietly in the crowd, with the people. A little girl spotted her and ran over, pulling her mother's sleeve. "Mom, that's Kamala. That's the lady from the video." People turned. They started clapping. Not for a politician, not for a title, but for someone who had stayed strong and gave others the courage to speak. A local teacher, Mrs. Porter, stepped forward and asked Kamala if she'd like to say something. Kamala smiled and took the mic. "I'm not here to be the center. I'm here to be the voice for the ones who were pushed aside. What happened to me happens every day to people who don't have a camera, or a badge, or a lawyer. But today, we are no longer silent. Today, we are each other's protection." The crowd clapped. Many cried. And then, something powerful happened. A man walked to the front holding a large sign with a single word: dignity. He stood there, holding it up high. Others joined on in silence. One by one, they lifted the same sign. Hundreds of signs, thousands of hearts. Dignity. It wasn't just a word now. It was a promise, a message, a movement. Back in the police department where Officer Reynolds once worked, change was finally being forced. Old files were opened. New training was introduced. Body cameras were now required for every officer, and a new rule was passed. Respect comes before authority. It was written on every wall inside the station, but not everyone was happy. Some officers still felt the system was too soft. Others whispered that Reynolds was treated unfairly, but a young officer named Tasha stood up in a department meeting and said, "If treating people with dignity feels like a punishment, then maybe you're in the wrong job." The room fell silent. Because truth often does that. Meanwhile, Kamala launched the listening tour. She traveled from city to city, town to town, sitting with people affected by unfair stops and police abuse. She listened, she cried, she took notes, and she made plans. But she didn't just want to collect stories. She wanted to fix the system that caused them. At a high school in Detroit, Kamala met a group of students. One boy, nervous but brave, stood up and asked, "Why didn't you shout when that officer disrespected you?" Kamala walked over and looked into his eyes. Because sometimes silence speaks louder than shouting, and sometimes silence gives the other person just enough rope to show who they really are. The students nodded, they understood. That evening, news broke that the case against Officer Reynolds would move to court. A formal hearing, witnesses' evidence. Justice Kamala didn't smile at the news. She didn't cheer, she simply closed her notebook and whispered, "Let truth speak, let justice walk, and let dignity lead the way." Outside her window, a little girl was drawing on the sidewalk with chalk. She was writing a single word in bright yellow, dignity. And Kamala knew. The turning point had arrived. The courtroom was full. Not just with people, but with history. It wasn't just Officer David Reynolds who was on trial. It was the way people like him had treated others for years, without facing real consequences. For the first time, millions were watching not through courtroom windows, but through live news, online streams, and social media updates. The people wanted justice not only for Kamala, but for everyone who didn't have a camera. Kamala arrived at the courthouse in a simple, gray suit. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't angry. She was ready. As she walked through the doors, a reporter called out, "Ms. Harris, what do you want from this trial?" Kamala paused, looked into the cameras. "I want the truth to be heard, not shouted, not twisted, just heard. And then, I want justice to follow it." Inside, Officer Reynolds sat with his lawyer. He looked smaller than before, tired, pale, nervous. He avoided looking at Kamala. He avoided looking at the cameras, but he couldn't avoid the truth anymore. The trial began with an infamous traffic stop video. The judge sat still as it played. On the screen, Kamala's calm face, Reynolds' aggressive tone, the crowd filming. The moment of realization, the silence, the truth. The room was silent when the video ended. Then came the witnesses. Jamal Carter, the man who had been stopped while walking home from work, Melissa Davis, the young woman who had filed a complaint 3 years earlier, Ruth, whose son never recovered from being falsely accused. They all spoke. Their voices were strong, but full of pain. Melissa stood at the front, her voice shaking at first. "I was stopped because I was a black woman driving a new car. He asked me if it was mine. He laughed when I showed my ID, and when I filed a complaint, they said he was just being cautious." She looked directly at Reynolds. "You didn't just stop cars. You stopped people from feeling safe in their own skin." The defense lawyer tried to argue. He said Officer Reynolds had a clean record on paper. He said maybe he was under pressure. He said the video showed a misunderstanding, not racism, but the crowd knew better. So did the judge, because patterns don't lie. Then Kamala was called to the stand. The room fell still. She took the oath, sat down, and looked directly at the lawyer. He began with a sharp question. "Why didn't you tell Officer Reynolds who you were right away?" Kamala answered clearly, "Because he shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with respect." Lawyer continued. "But aren't you used to special treatment? Important rooms? Big titles?" Kamala's reply was soft but powerful. "Yes, I've sat in rooms where my title gave me power, but I've also stood on sidewalks where my skin took that power away." There was nothing else the defense could say. The truth had already spoken. Outside, crowds waited with signs. "We believe her. Respect isn't earned, it's owed. Justice is watching." People from other cities joined too. Mothers, fathers, students, workers. The courtroom had walls, but the story had none. After days of testimony, the judge finally spoke. His words were slow, careful, and heavy. "This case is not just about one mistake. It is about behavior repeated, patterns ignored, voices silenced. Officer David Reynolds is hereby found guilty of racial misconduct and abuse of power. He will lose his badge, and he will face charges for every case reopened by the department." The courtroom clapped quietly, not like a celebration, but like relief. A weight had been lifted. A truth had been heard. A system had been shaken. Kamala walked out of the building into the sunlight. A young girl ran up to her with a notebook. "Can you sign this?" the girl asked. Kamala knelt down, smiled, and asked, "What do you want me to write?" The girl whispered, "Write something brave." Kamala thought for a moment, then wrote, "Let truth walk beside you, even when the road is rough." Kamala as the crowd began to leave. Kamala looked around. No more cameras. No more shouting. Just people, real people, walking home with hope. Inside the courtroom, Reynolds sat alone. The badge was gone, but the truth remained. The silence. He had once used to ignore people. Now it surrounded him. Weeks had passed since the courtroom decision. Officer Reynolds was no longer in uniform. His name had been removed from the department's website. His badge, the one he once used as protection, now sat locked away, in a box. The world had moved on from his story, but Kamala's story had just begun. Across the country, people were still talking about her silence, not as weakness, but as a powerful stand. Her calm during injustice had become a symbol of strength, and her actions had opened doors for thousands who had once felt ignored. The Respect First program now had over 50,000 volunteers in 30 cities. Free legal aid, body cam training, reporting, apps, all tools created to protect dignity before damage, and at the center of it all was a woman who had simply wanted to go to a school event. One morning, Kamala visited a small classroom in Chicago. There were no cameras, no reporters, just 20 students and one worn CHALKBOARD. The teacher introduced her. The kids clapped politely. Kamala sat down on the floor with them, crossing her legs, and asked, "Can I tell you a story?" They nodded eagerly. Once, there was a little girl who was stopped on her bike for no reason. She was told she didn't belong, that she looked wrong. But she kept going. She grew up, and one day, the world saw her. Not because she shouted, but because she stayed strong. A small boy raised his hand and asked, "Was that girl you?" Kamala smiled gently. "Yes, but it could be any of us, even you." At that moment, it wasn't about politics, not about law, not about power. It was about belonging. News outlets had moved on to other headlines, but in communities across the country, people still remembered in barbershops, in college dorms, in living rooms, and protests. They spoke her name, not as a celebrity, but as a turning point. She didn't yell, she didn't fight back, she just stood tall, and let the world see what happens in silence. And the world had seen. It saw how one officer's racism exposed a broken system. It saw how truth couldn't stay hidden behind a badge. And it saw how one woman turned a moment of pain into a national movement. Months later, Kamala was asked to speak at the grand opening of the Dignity Center, a new nonprofit that would offer legal support, mental health services, and education about civil rights. It was built using donations from ordinary people, not billionaires, not corporations, just citizens who believed in justice. As she stepped onto the stage, Kamala looked out at the crowd. There were old faces, Jamal, Melissa, Ruth. There were new faces, students, young leaders, mothers holding babies. She cleared her throat and began. When I was stopped on that road, I didn't plan to start a movement. I was just tired. I didn't want to explain my worth anymore. I didn't want to prove I belonged. But what happened next wasn't about me. It was about us, our shared story, our quiet pain, our silent strength. And today, we turn that silence into legacy. The crowd stood in applause, not wild cheering, but the kind of respect that is quiet, full, and deep. A respect earned, not by shouting, but by never letting go of dignity. As the sun began to set, Kamala stood alone outside the building. A little girl ran up to her again, this time, holding a drawing. It was a picture of Kamala standing with a heart on her chest and the words, "I am not afraid anymore." Kamala kneeled down and asked, "What's your name?" The girl whispered, "Hope." Kamala smiled and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's exactly what you are." Behind them, the building lights turned on. A new chapter had begun, and this time, it started with truth. It moved through courage,